Champagne glass hit the marble floor before anyone understood what had just happened. 1 second it was in his hand. The next it was in pieces at his feet, and the old man was staring at a maid. Not at her face. Not at her uniform. At the small darkened ring hanging from a faded red thread around her neck. Clara did not notice him at first. She was on her knees, scrubbing a wine stain off the marble floor of the Ashford Grand Ballroom, surrounded by the laughter of people who had never once learned her name. The gala was in full swing, crystal chandeliers, a live string quartet, women in gowns that cost more than Clara earned in a year. She moved through the room like a ghost, invisible and expected, filling that role the way water fills the lowest part of a container. Then the man in the red blazer crouched down beside her. "Nice necklace," he said loud enough for the people nearby to hear. His name was Preston Vale, 28 years old, the son of a shipping magnate, and a person who had never once been told no without consequences. He reached out and flicked the ring with his finger like it was a piece of garbage. "Where did you find that?" "A trash heap." Laughter rippled through the cluster of guests nearby. Clara kept scrubbing. Her jaw was tight but her hands were steady. She had learned a long time ago that reacting to men like Preston only made things worse. "I asked you a question," he said, and before she could move, his fingers closed around the thread and yanked. The thread snapped. Clara was on her feet before she even made the decision to stand. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, hard, and the ballroom went quiet in a radius of about 10 feet. People turned. Heads lifted from conversations. The string quartet played on, oblivious. "Give it back," Clara said. Her voice was low and completely level. No fear in it. No begging. Preston blinked, surprised by the grip. Then his expression darkened with something nastier than amusement. He held the ring up above his head, out of her reach. "Cheap antique junk," he said. "What is this, some kind of heirloom? Did your grandmother leave you this from her collection of worthless things?" The laughter came back, harder this time. Clara's eyes filled, not from shame but from something much older and much deeper. She reached up, still trying to get the ring back, and her voice cracked just once, just a single clean fracture, when she spoke. "It is the last thing my mother left me before she disappeared." The laughter faded. Not because anyone felt sorry for her. Because across the ballroom, an elderly man in a dark gray suit had gone completely still. His name was Edmund Furey. 74 years old. Former chief legal counsel for the Ashford Empire. A man who had spent 40 years keeping the secrets of the most powerful family in the country. He had attended this gala 100 times. He had watched the world change from that same corner of the room for decades. And right now his champagne glass was in pieces on the floor and his hands were shaking. Because the ring dangling from Preston Vale's fingers, the old darkened ring with the strange engraving on its face, was not cheap antique junk. Edmund Furey had seen that ring exactly once before in his life. At a funeral. 32 years ago. Clara had worked at Ashford Manor for 11 months. She had arrived the way most maids arrived. Quietly, with references she had spent 6 months carefully building, and with a face that gave nothing away. The estate was massive. 40 rooms, 14 staff, a kitchen that never slept, and at the center of it all Vivian Ashford. Vivian was 51 years old, elegant in the way that very expensive things are elegant, cold and perfectly maintained. She had married into the Ashford name at 26 and spent the following 25 years sharpening herself into a weapon capable of holding on to it. The Empire, a vast network of real estate, private equity and infrastructure holdings, had expanded under her management after her husband's death 8 years ago. She was respected. He was feared. And she was, by the quiet consensus of every person who worked for her, completely without mercy. From the first week Clara started work, Vivian had watched her. Not obviously. Not with the open hostility she showed to staff who made mistakes or spoke out of turn. It was something quieter than that. A sidelong look when Clara entered a room, a slight tightening around the eyes when their paths crossed in a hallway. Twice, Clara had caught Vivian staring at her from across a courtyard with an expression she couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was something closer to recognition. Or maybe fear. Clara had filed it away and said nothing. Saying nothing was something she had become very good at. The morning after the gala incident, Vivian called Clara into her private office. It was 7 in the morning. Clara had been awake since 5, scrubbing the floor of the gala hall back to its original shine. She knocked twice on the office door and entered when told to. Vivian was standing at the window with her back to the room. She didn't turn around. "You caused a scene last night," she said. "A guest took my property," Clara said. "I retrieved it." Vivian turned then. The look on her face was difficult to read. "You will serve dinner personally tonight. Board meeting. Every major investor. You will pour the wine, clear the plates, and you will not speak unless spoken to." She paused. "You will also remove that ring before you enter the room." Clara looked at her steadily. "The ring stays with me." The silence that followed had texture to it. "That was not a request," Vivian said. "No," Clara agreed. "It was not." She turned and walked out before Vivian could respond. In the hallway her heart was hammering. But her hands were completely still. 11 months of patience, and tonight the board would be in one room. Clara pressed the ring against her chest and breathed. Almost. The Ashford dining room could seat 30 comfortably. Tonight it held 14. The 7-member board of the Ashford Empire for senior investors, 2 legal representatives, and Vivian herself at the head of the table, dressed in black, in absolute control. Clara moved around the table with practiced quiet, pouring wine from a crystal decanter into each glass. Nobody looked at her directly. That was normal. She was furniture to these people, functional, expected, and ignored. She had gotten halfway around the table when it happened. The ring, which she had secured again with a new thread that morning, slipped from beneath her collar as she leaned forward to pour. The thread caught on the decanter's handle, and before she could stop it, the ring swung out and landed on the white tablecloth with a soft, clear sound. Such a small sound. Such a small object. And yet, the man directly across from where it landed stopped mid-sentence. His name was Professor Alistair Morrow. 70 years old, grey-bearded, the Empire's retained legal historian and one of the world's foremost scholars of private inheritance law. He was mid-conversation about projected fourth-quarter earnings when the ring landed on the table in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked again. Clara reached for the ring, but he put his hand over it, gently, not grabbing it, and lifted it carefully between 2 fingers, turning it toward the candlelight. "Excuse me," he said. His voice had changed. The smooth professional tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded like a man trying to control a violent emotion. "Where did you get this?" The table had gone quiet. Vivian sat up straighter at the far end. Her wine glass was at her lips, but she had stopped drinking. "It belonged to my mother," Clara said. Morrow turned the ring over. He found what he was looking for on the inside of the band, an engraved symbol so small and worn with age that most people would never notice it. His hands began to tremble. "That seal," he whispered, and his voice barely made it above the sound of the candles. "That seal belongs to the founding bloodline." Vivian set down her wine glass. The sound of crystal on wood was very loud in the silence. "Professor Morrow," she said, and her tone was a warning. "No," he said, and he said it to her in a way that a person says no when they have been waiting a very long time to say it. He set the ring down on the table. He looked at Clara. "Sit down, please." "She is serving," Vivian started. "Sit down." He said it to Vivian this time. And the room, the 14 most powerful people connected to the Ashford Empire, obeyed the command in the old man's voice and went completely still. Clara sat. Professor Morrow took a long breath. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a pair of reading glasses. He looked at the ring again under the candlelight for a full 30 seconds before he spoke. 32 years ago, he began, the founder of this empire, Gerald Ashford, had a daughter. Her name was Alara. She was not the heir he had publicly named in his business documents. She was the heir he named in a sealed private trust, drawn up under the Imperial Sovereign Clause, an old and almost never used provision in private inheritance law that supersedes all other documentation, all other legal transfers, all other claims. He paused. That clause could only be activated by one thing. The Imperial Sovereign Ring, a ring Gerald Ashford had commissioned when his daughter was born, engraved with the seal of his founding charter and given to her to keep. He held the ring up. The seal caught the light. "There was a fire," he continued. "Alara Ashford died in that fire along with her infant daughter. The ring was presumed destroyed. The trust reverted, or was believed to have reverted, to the next named party. He looked down the table at Vivian. The late Richard Ashford. And then upon his death to his wife. The room was so quiet that the candles sounded like a roar. But, Morrow said, if the ring was not destroyed. If the infant daughter survived. And if she carries the mark of the founding bloodline. He stopped. He looked at Clara's wrist. Clara went still. He reached across the table without touching her and pointed. May I see your left wrist? Clara turned her wrist over. There, on the inside of her forearm, was a birthmark she had carried her entire life. Irregular, small, slightly darker than her skin. Her mother had kissed it when she was a child. Had told her it was a sign that she was meant for great things. Had said it was the mark of someone who comes from somewhere important. Morrow made a sound she had never heard from a grown man before. He opened his briefcase, he carried it everywhere, everyone knew that, and from a sealed folder produced a photocopied page from an old legal archive. He slid it across the table. On it was a hand-drawn crest. And inside the crest, in the exact same irregular shape, was the mark recorded in the founding family's medical records. An identical birthmark. The guests were not laughing now. At the head of the table, Vivian Ashford had gone the color of old chalk. You need to understand, Vivian said, and her voice was still controlled, still the voice of a woman who had survived things these people had never imagined, that this girl is a maid. She walked into my house with forged references and a stolen antique, and now she is sitting at my board table being offered a fairy tale by a man who has clearly lost his sense of professional judgment. Vivian. The voice came from the other end of the table. Reginald Croft. Senior board member. 63 years old, usually silent, usually the last person to speak. He was holding a manila envelope that no one had seen him produce. 2 weeks ago, he said quietly, I received a notification from the court records office. Sealed documents from the original fire investigation, sealed for 30 years under an order filed by your late husband's attorneys, were declassified. He slid the envelope toward the center of the table. The fire that killed Alara Ashford was not an accident. The investigation was closed under pressure. And the initial findings, suppressed at the time, indicate the presence of an accelerant in 2 locations that could not be explained by accident or electrical fault. Nobody moved. Richard Ashford's firm was named in the suppressed findings, Croft continued, as the party who filed the closure order. He looked at Vivian. Your husband arranged to have those files buried. And I believe you knew. The chandelier above the table suddenly felt very heavy. Vivian stood up. This is slander. This is a coordinated attack on this family and I will not. Sit down, Vivian, Morrow said for the second time that night. And this time she sat. The room looked at Clara. Clara looked at the ring on the table in front of her. She picked it up slowly and held it in her palm. She had carried this ring for 24 years. She had slept with it under her pillow as a child. She had hidden it in the lining of her coat during the years she spent moving from place to place, city to city, following a trail of documents and names and whispered half-truths her mother had left behind before she vanished. My mother's name was Senna, Clara said. Her voice was steady. She named me Clara and told me that the name came from her mother, whose name I never knew. She disappeared when I was 9 years old. Before she left, she put this ring around my neck and told me 3 things. She told me never to remove it. She told me never to speak of it to people who had power over me. And she told me. Clara paused. She looked up from the ring and looked directly at Vivian. She told me, if powerful people ever fear you, this ring is the reason why. A board member exhaled. Someone else at the table looked away. I spent 15 years looking for answers, Clara said. I traced the name Ashford through every public record I could find. I found references to the fire. I found records of the investigation that was closed too quickly. I found the name of the law firm that filed the closure order. And I found the name of the woman who became the Empire's primary beneficiary 18 months after Alara Ashford died in that fire. She looked at Vivian again. I came here to find out what really happened to my mother's family. I became a maid in this house because it was the only way inside. Vivian's voice was barely above a whisper. You have no proof of any of this. The ring is proof, Morrow said. The birthmark is proof. The sealed court documents are proof. And the Imperial Sovereign Clause does not require a court battle, Vivian. It requires the ring, the bloodline mark, and a formal declaration before a quorum of the board. He looked around the table. We currently have a quorum. He folded his hands. I move that we formally recognize the Imperial Sovereign Clause and proceed with verification. Seconded, said Croft without hesitation. The vote was 7-0. Vivian did not vote. She had stopped breathing. Morrow asked Clara to hand him the ring one more time. She did. He turned it under the light, running a thumbnail along the inner edge of the band. Most people, if they handled the ring, would feel nothing unusual. But Morrow had spent 40 years studying the physical construction of historical legal objects. Wax seals, engraved titles, concealment devices used by wealthy families in eras before digital security. He pressed a specific point on the band's interior ridge. There was a tiny, almost inaudible click. A hair-thin seam along the bottom edge of the ring separated by less than a millimeter. Inside, pressed flat, protected by the metal, was a piece of material no larger than a postage stamp. Not paper. Something older. Treated vellum. Morrow exhaled slowly. He removed it with tweezers from his briefcase. He had tweezers in his briefcase because he was the kind of man who had tweezers in his briefcase, and unfolded it on the white tablecloth under the light. The engraving was tiny but precise. The original seal of ownership. The founding charter mark. Gerald Ashford's personal sigil, pressed into the vellum in faded red ink. And below it, in handwriting so small and careful it was almost a whisper made permanent. To my true heir, trust kindness more than power. Claire read it twice. Then she pressed her hand flat against the table because she needed something solid underneath her. The board member to her left, a woman named Delphine who had never once acknowledged Clara's presence in 11 months of dinners and meetings, quietly pushed a glass of water toward her. Thank you, Clara said. It was such a small thing. A glass of water. And yet Clara felt it like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for a very long time. Within 40 minutes of the board vote, 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, Reginald Croft made a call to the firm that had been retained as the Empire's independent auditors for the past decade. He told them to begin an emergency review of all ownership documentation, transfer records, and offshore account structures associated with Vivian Ashford's personal financial management of the Empire's trust. This was a call he had been waiting to make for 2 years. He made it from the hallway, still holding his napkin from dinner. Second, Professor Morrow contacted a colleague at the National Archive who confirmed, within 20 minutes, because the file had apparently been flagged for review before and never actioned, that the founding bloodline documentation was intact, complete, and had never been legally voided. Third, the front gates of the estate opened to admit 3 police vehicles. They were not unexpected. Croft had made a second call. When the officers entered the dining room, Vivian was still at the table. She had not moved for 20 minutes. The room had slowly emptied around her as board members moved to phones and side rooms and hushed conversations, and she had sat at the head of a table that was no longer hers, in a house that had never truly been hers, wearing a black gown that had cost $8,000, and she had stared at the ring in Clara's hand like a woman watching something she buried come slowly back to the surface. Vivian Ashford, the lead officer said, you are being detained in connection with fraud, conspiracy to suppress evidence, and complicity in the falsification of inheritance documentation. Vivian stood. She straightened her gown. She lifted her chin. I want my attorney, she said. Of course, the officer said. She walked toward the door. She passed Clara without looking at her. Then she stopped. She did not turn around. But she stopped. I knew who you were, she said, her back still to the room, her voice so flat it barely registered as human emotion. I knew the moment you walked through the gate. You have her eyes. Pause. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the past was finished. Another pause. I was wrong about many things. She walked out. The room was silent for a long moment. Clara looked down at the ring in her hand. Then she looked at the tiny piece of vellum still lying open on the table. Trust kindness more than power. She folded it carefully and tucked it back inside the ring. It was close to midnight when Clara walked through the servants' corridor to the kitchen. The rest of the staff had heard. Word moves faster through the back corridors of a mansion than through any boardroom. Mrs. Dow, the head cook, was standing at the kitchen counter with a dish towel in her hand and tears running down her face. Thomas, the groundskeeper who had always left an extra plate of food outside the laundry room on Clara's late shifts, was sitting in a chair with his cap in his hands and the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to make a sound. Priya, who had been Clara's only genuine friend in the house, was standing in the doorway to the pantry, and when she saw Clara she made a sound like something inside her had finally been allowed to break. Claire went to Priya first. She put her arms around her and held on. "You knew," Priya whispered. "I suspected," Clara said. "I wasn't sure. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you." "Don't apologize." Priya pulled back and looked at her. "Don't you dare apologize." Clara went to Mrs. Dow next. The cook pressed her hands between both of hers and couldn't speak for a moment. "You fed me on my first night," Clara told her. "I came in out of the cold and you handed me a bowl of soup without asking a single question. I have thought about that night many times." Mrs. Dow made the sound of a woman who had made peace with a great many things and was now quietly overwhelmed by one more. Thomas stood and held out his hand. Clara shook it. He nodded once, the way people nod when words are insufficient, and Clara nodded back. "Whatever comes next," Clara said, looking at all of them, "you stay. All of you. Nothing changes for any of you except that you will be treated the way you should always have been treated." "What will you do with it?" Mrs. Dow asked. "The empire?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this. She had thought about it for years. In the abstract, in the hypothetical, in the late nights when she lay on her cot in the room above the laundry and stared at the ceiling and allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like if the thing her mother had hinted at was actually real. "Something my grandfather would have approved of," she said. "Something that justifies the fact that it was worth taking it back." 3 days later, Clara stood in the Ashford Empire's main conference room, a room she had cleaned 14 times but never once sat in, and faced the board, the press, and a cluster of cameras whose lenses caught the light the same way the ring did. She was wearing a gray suit borrowed from Delphine, who had turned out to be unexpectedly generous once the earth had shifted beneath everyone's feet. The ring was on her finger now, not hidden, not tied to a thread, not tucked beneath a collar. On her finger where it had always been meant to be. She read from a prepared statement, but only for the first 2 sentences. Then she set the paper down and spoke directly. "The Ashford Empire has operated for 40 years as a monument to the accumulation of wealth," she said. "My grandfather built it from nothing. And then the people who came after him used it to serve themselves. That ends now." She announced the creation of the Alara Foundation, named for her grandmother, which would allocate a significant portion of the empire's annual earnings to the construction and maintenance of shelters, schools, and clinics in the city's most under-resourced districts. She named a board of oversight drawn from community organizations, not corporate offices. She announced a full internal audit of the empire's financial practices and a commitment to publishing the results publicly. There was applause in the room, but not the kind Clara had watched at 100 galas. The polished, performative kind, the sound of people clapping for themselves. This was quieter. More uncertain. More real. Afterward, in the hallway, one of the investors who had laughed at her on the floor of the gala caught her arm. "Miss," he stopped himself. "Miss Ashford. I want to say." "You don't need to," Clara said. "I laughed," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." He kept walking. Some things did not require forgiveness on a schedule. On the night of the 7th day, Clara rode the elevator to the top floor of the Ashford Tower alone. It was 11 at night. The city spread out below the floor-to-ceiling windows like a grid of living light, yellow and white, and the occasional red pulse of a distant signal. Somewhere out there in the neighborhoods she had grown up passing through without stopping, people were finishing late shifts and walking home through cold streets and making calculations about which bill to pay this month and which to defer. She knew what that felt like. She had felt it every single month for 15 years. She stood at the window for a long time with the ring on her finger and her reflection ghosted in the glass in front of her. A reporter, one she had agreed to this final question from as a gesture toward transparency, stood a few steps behind her with a small recorder and the careful posture of someone trying not to disturb a moment. "Miss Ashford," the reporter said softly. "How does it feel? To finally own everything?" Clara watched the city for another moment before she answered. "The empire was never the real inheritance," she said. "The real inheritance was learning who still had a heart when they thought I was nobody." The reporter didn't write it down fast enough. She asked Clara to repeat it. Clara did. Then Clara asked to be left alone for a while. In the quiet of the empty floor, she opened the ring one more time and read the vellum by the light of the city. She had read it 40 times now. She suspected she would read it 400 more. Trust kindness more than power. Her grandfather, a man she had never met, a man she would never meet, a man who had built something vast and then hidden its true key inside a ring small enough to hold in one hand, had known something that the people who came after him had forgotten. That the measure of an empire was not its balance sheet. It was the quality of the people it made room for. Clara closed the ring. Outside the city hummed. And then her phone buzzed. He picked it up. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 15 years of searching, the same quiet knowing that had walked her through the gate of this mansion 11 months ago, made her press the green button and raise the phone to her ear. A voice. Female. Older. Slightly breathless, like someone who had been waiting a very long time to make a call and had only just found the courage. Clara, the voice said. Clara stopped breathing. Clara, it's me. The city lights blurred. She knew that voice. She had heard it last when she was 9 years old, standing in a doorway, watching a woman she loved walk away into the dark. Mom, she whispered. The line was silent for 1 second. 2, 3. Then. There's something I never told you. Something about the ring. About why they really wanted you to disappear. Clara's hand tightened on the phone. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her. The empire behind her, the city below her, the ring on her finger. She had thought the story was over. It was not over. Tell me, she said. True royalty is revealed by character, not wealth.